Hello. I wanted to talk about Voronoi texture scattering, some issues that can arise when you're using it, how a lot of people go about fixing those issues, but also why a lot of those solutions are not very suitable for most scenarios. I wanted to talk about how I go about resolving those issues, using techniques that I don't see very often, and I think they're a lot more effective and still very simple. And I think it also serves as a basis to make more sophisticated texture scattering approaches. And if you're interested in a completely no compromises solution, then I've got you covered for that as well. So, what's Voronoi texture scattering, for those who don't know? Well, if you take a texture, even a seamless one like this height map here, and you scale it up a bunch, even though the texture itself is seamless, there is no visible seam between cells, you can still notice a visible repetition when it's scaled up like this. So, one solution for this is to use Voronoi cells instead of tiling the texture along a regular grid. And those cells having random positions can help break up the texture and make it look more varied. I can set up a really simple example of this here. I'm going to add a Voronoi texture and set this to 2D. And I want to look at the position vector for the cells. And then I'm going to subtract the Voronoi cell position from the original UVs like this. And now you can see that we have these sort of UVs in each cell. The reason this works is because our Voronoi position vector returns the position of sort of an entire cell. And what we're doing is we're taking the original UVs and then just offsetting them based on that position. So we're moving the center of our UVs to wherever the cell is positioned. Now, the reason I use the scale node here is because as we scale our Voronoi texture like this, you'll see that the UVs actually darken quite a bit. And while you can account for this by plugging in a scale node at the end and plugging in whatever value you use here for the same scale node, now as you scale it, it looks fine. Leaving the Voronoi scale at 1 and then just scaling the UVs ahead of time does the exact same thing, and this is just going to be easier to work with. So if we plug this into our texture, we're going to notice a few things. Just for the sake of demonstration, I am also going to change this repeat option to clip, which means our texture is not going to tile, and that's just going to make it easier to visualize what's going on here. Because textures map to UV coordinates between 0 and 1, but our Voronoi cells have UVs between, say, -1 and 1 about. We can fix this by just adding 0.5. This just shifts the UVs of our Voronoi cell, so where the vector used to be 0, 0 now becomes 0.5, 0.5, which corresponds to the center of our UVs that we want to use for image textures. And so now our image textures are centered on each cell. By the way, there's a bit of a bug. It might be hard to see with YouTube compression, but sometimes you'll get this really weird aliasing between edges of cells like this. This is just a weird EV thing. This can be fixed by using anything except for linear interpolation for your images. You could set it to closest or cubic or smart or whatever. I'll just set it to cubic for now. But if you've ever come across that before, then that's how you fix that. And obviously our texture is a bit too small here. We might want to scale it up. And we want to actually scale it before this add node here, because we want the origin of our cell, in other words this 0, 0 position, to be centered in our cell when we scale it. And then we want to offset our UVs after that to do the image specific mapping. So now as we scale this, you can see that our images stay centered in our cell. Now you're going to notice an issue. Even though our texture is a seamless texture, we are getting these seams again, and that's because the texture is only really made to tile along a regular grid. I'm going to reduce the scale to 1 again just to make this easier to see. The way most people would go about fixing this is by using some kind of distortion or noise to either try to blur the seams between cells or distort it or something like that. And I'm going to show how you would do that and why this is kind of not the best approach. If we go here and add just a white noise texture, for example, like this, and then scale that white noise texture down to a much smaller amount, you can see that we can start to blur the seams, but there's some directionality going on. That's because our white noise goes between 0 and 1, but we want to offset our texture in both the negative and positive directions. So to fix that, we can just subtract this color by 0.5. And now as we scale it, you can see that we're kind of just blurring at the seams. So this, right off the bat, looks like it's a pretty effective method. And by the way, if you want to replace all these nodes here, you can add a color mix node set to linear light. And if you just plug the noise texture in like this, it's going to do the whole subtracting and scaling and adding right in this node group here. And you can just change the factor to control how much this is going to blur the seams. If I now scale my texture to, say, 0.5 again, it looks like our seams are gone. There's a bit of noise, but I want to show what happens when you try to use this for displacement. So you can see that we have our texture here, but along the edges of our Voronoi cells, we're getting this really weird sort of spotty looking area. It's got lots of holes and spikes and just a lot of weird stuff going on. This can kind of be made less of an issue by using, say, a noise texture like this. And while this might look fine at a glance here, you're going to notice that the noise texture doesn't actually get rid of these big seams, it just sort of makes them round and distorted. So if we look at our height map again, we still see these Voronoi cells, the seams are just kind of distorted. And to understand how to fix this, we first need to understand why sort of blurring out the seams like this works for regular old colors, but doesn't seem to work for height maps and displacement. If I make a mixed node up here and I try to mix between blue and pink, then when our factor is at 0% we have blue, when it's at 100% we have pink. Anything in between, it's going to just sort of linearly interpolate between them. So if it's at 0.5, it's going to use 50% of each. And this all makes sense so far, this is pretty intuitive. But the really important thing to note here is that when our factor is at either 0 or 1, we are only using one of these colors, which makes sense. We're using 100% of one and 0% of the other. So when it's at 1, we're using all pink, and when it's at 0, we're using all blue. Now, let's say we're trying to blend between two image textures instead, like this. In this scenario, we're looking at one image texture exclusively, and here we are looking at the other one exclusively. But anything where we're not using a factor of 0 or 1, we need to look at both of these image textures in order to figure out how we are going to blend between them. And this can start to cause issues. And to make the comparison even more similar, we're going to try blending between one image texture and then the same image texture just rotated 90 degrees. As we change the factor, we're blending between them how you'd expect, but we are still fundamentally looking at two different image textures here. If we wanted to get the same result using just one image texture, then we run into a bit of an issue. Your first thought might be to just blend between the UVs, and then to sample a single image texture like this. But this doesn't really work, and the reason this doesn't work is because our UVs are vector coordinates that tell us where we're supposed to look at our image. In order to know how these two different image textures should blend together, we need to know the values of both. You can't make a purple if you only have either blue or pink. You need to look at blue and pink, these two different images, right? There is a really strange solution for this though, that seems to sort of bypass this rule. If we go ahead and add a white noise texture and plug in a greater than node, and then plug this into our factor, then you'll notice how as I change this threshold here, it sort of looks like we're blending between our two image textures. Now, if we think about what greater than means, this is a binary value, right? We're checking some condition, and we are returning either true or false. I'm going to pixelate our UV coordinates with a snap node so I can better show what's happening here. If you pick just a single pixel to keep your eye on, you'll notice it only changes between one of two colors. It's not blending between anything. And if we take a look at our factor here, it looks like it's sort of going between black and white, but really any given pixel is still either using black or white. Dithering does have a lot of utility, but this is one of its fundamental limitations. In this example, we are either using this set of UVs or the rotated set of UVs for each pixel, not trying to blend between them, just using one or the other. And this noise is kind of tricking our eyes into seeing both images when any given pixel is either showing one or the other and not blending between them. So if we go back to our blue and our pink, you can see that here. If we set our factor to say 0.5 and then mute our snap node here, it looks purplish, but every pixel on our screen is either using pink or blue. And to be honest, this is fine for a lot of use cases, especially when you're working with just exclusively colors. But if you want to use this for anything beyond just the direct colors rendered to your screen, you run into issues. While the displacement doesn't apply to every pixel on our screen, it applies to every vertex in our mesh. This means that each vertex is either using this lower down height map or the up high one, resulting in a lot of spikes and holes, which is what we saw before with our Voronoi texture scattering. You'll also see issues with this when you're trying to apply it to bump maps, normal maps, roughness maps, etc. It basically only works for colors. So I'm going to delete our linear light and our noise right here. And now we know that in order to blend between two image textures in a way that works with things like displacement and bump maps and all that, we can't just use one image texture. But this is where it gets a little tricky, because we can't just transform the image textures for each cell manually and try to blend between them like that. So how do we keep the number of image textures we need as low as possible while still blending between the cells adequately? Well, let's take a step back and look at the Voronoi node by itself. It has this option that a lot of people don't use called F2, which you can see here. It computes the distance to the second closest point as well as its position and color. And so what exactly does this mean? Well, a Voronoi texture is basically just a bunch of points, and you're getting the distance to the closest point for every given pixel on your screen, which is how you end up with something like this. Where the distance to the points is nearly 0, you get the darker colors, and where the distance is further away, you get the brighter colors. If you were to assign each point a color, say this point over here is a brownish color, then you can just say that every pixel where that point is the closest, it'll also inherit that same brown color. And of course, the position vector is just the exact position of that point. So if we're looking at F2 Voronoi, and we change it to color here, you'll see that this brown cell that we saw before is no longer brown, but it has a lot of brown around the outside of it. That's because within this cell, the brown point is the closest point, but it's obviously not the second closest point. So when we're looking at the second closest point, we see different colors. That said, I want you to take note of something. The brown cell now has this sort of grayish cell within it, and that gray cell actually corresponds to the edge of our Voronoi cell that neighbors this gray cell. And if we're looking at this gray cell down here, it has a brown section right here that also corresponds to the edge that neighbors our brown cell. With this, we can divide each of our Voronoi cells into these slices, where we can then take a look at the slice that is neighboring the edge. If we just take a look at this whole sort of gray and brown section right here, you'll notice that it looks gray and brown in this circled area, regardless of whether I'm using F2 or F1 Voronoi, right? So something pretty crazy happens when we mix between these two. As our factor approaches 0.5, you'll see that the seam between the cell goes away. And that makes sense because 50% brown and 50% gray is the same as 50% gray and 50% brown. So that's interesting, but how easy is it to apply this to our texture mapping? And the answer is actually very easy. I'm going to select everything from our Voronoi node and onward, and I'm going to use Ctrl-Shift-D to duplicate them and keep the connection. I'm going to set the Voronoi to F2, which means we'll use the second closest cell to map our texture instead of the first closest. And if I now mix between these cells, as our factor approaches 0.5, you'll see that the seam between these cells goes away. You will still see seams in some areas, and the reason for that is because these are areas where more than two cells could attribute to the color of that pixel. We are only blending between the closest and second closest cell. Now, we don't just want our images to have this like 50% opacity, we only want to blend between these two cells when we're on the very edge of our Voronoi cell. Luckily, Blender also has this distance to edge option for our Voronoi texture, which gives us the distance to the edge. I'm going to add a map range, and I'm going to lower this from max value to be, say, at 0.1. And what this lets us do is say, where the distance used to be 0, we want this to be at 0.5, because that was where the seam sort of vanished. And where the distance reaches, say, 0.1, we want this value to be 0. By increasing this from max value, we can sort of increase the radius of this selection, but I'm going to leave it low for now. And if we plug that into our mix node here, you can see that we're sort of just perfectly blending between these images. As I change this from max value, you can see that this blending radius sort of changes along with it, and we can add a value node over here to more easily control that. But you'll also notice that if we try to scale up our texture, we also need to scale up our second texture here with the exact same value. So you could add a value node here to the scale to make sure they're both being scaled identically, but while we're at it, I'm actually going to remove the scale node and add a full mapping node here. We'll just add these here. And we can just connect both of these to our mapping node. Make sure to set scale to 1. Now you can see that we can offset our image here, we can rotate it like this, and we can scale it on each axis. Let's say we want to add some randomness to this though. By separating the XYZ of our color output from our Voronoi texture, we can get 3 separate random values. And for now I'm just going to show you how you would randomize the rotation, but it's the exact same if you want to apply this to scale or translation as well. First of all, we probably want some way to influence this, so I'm going to add a multiply node. If this is at 0, then it's just going to make everything 0, which means our random rotation will have no effect. And if it's at 1, we want it to have full effect. We need to multiply this by 2 times pi, and that corresponds to a full rotation, which means at a strength of 1, we're going to have full random rotation, and at a strength of, say, 0.5, they're only going to go between 0 and 180 degrees. Because we want this to affect our Z rotation specifically, I'm going to plug that into a combine XYZ here. We want to find which node is plugged into the rotation here, and we simply want to add it to that. And now, if this value is at 0, there's no random rotation, but if it's at 1, we have full random rotation. And you of course need to replicate this for the Voronoi texture down here as well. There's a really easy way to do this though, and it's to just delete that, duplicate this again, and set this to F2 again. Then if you plug this in, everything's properly connected. Funnily enough, you can simplify this a ton using a vector multiply add if you know what you're doing. And of course, if you want to randomize position and scaling as well, you can use the other values for this randomness here. But let's say you run out of random values to use. Well, you can always add a white noise texture, set this to 1D, plug your X value into here, and you can see that this color output is going to be different than this Voronoi color output. You can use another separate XYZ to get 3 more unique colors out of this that are different from these 3. And with that, you can get as many random values out of this as you want. And if your texture isn't seamless, you can kind of just scale it up like this until the seams go away. If it is seamless, you can just change this back to repeat. And you won't see any of these seams between your textures. You can obviously still play with the scaling like this. If it's too small though, you're going to notice that you will see the visible repetition within each Voronoi cell, so just find the values that work for you. And there are still caveats with this approach, which I will talk about, but first let's see if this works with height maps. You want to be sure to set this to non-color, plug it into height, and you can see that our texture has no more visible repetition. You can of course scale this up as much as you want and you won't see any more of that grid-like tiling. And we also don't have any of the weird dithering issues that we had before, so that's all working perfectly. But if you're really perceptive, you may notice something. There are actually still seams in our texture. If we look in areas like this, we can see kind of a few over here. There are some down here as well. And if we get rid of the displacement and scale this a bit differently, they become a bit easier to see. There are clearly seams in certain areas. So this is just one of the drawbacks to the Voronoi approach. These seams are pretty hard to notice, and I still think this approach is far more suitable for most use cases compared to the dithering approach. Although, if you are exclusively using colors and the dithering doesn't pose any issues with what you're doing, you might actually want to go with that to avoid these occasional seams that pop up when you're using the whole F2 approach to Voronoi texture scattering. And the reason this happens is because we are only blending between the closest and second closest cells. These are areas where the pixel's color could be influenced by more than 2 cells. And we aren't checking the third closest because Blender doesn't have, like, F3 Voronoi. There are even situations like this down here, which can get a bit gross. You could have pixels potentially influenced by up to 4 or 5 Voronoi cells. These exact same techniques can be used for more sophisticated texture scattering that gets rid of that issue though. And I haven't even talked about the myriad of other issues that are very common with this kind of texture scattering, such as normal maps, which are orientation dependent, and most people don't actually consider that when they go randomly rotating them. Luckily, I was actually commissioned to make a no compromises solution to all of this by this guy right here, Curtis Holt. If you're somehow one of the like 6 people who watches my channel and doesn't know who Curtis Holt is, he's really cool. He makes a lot of incredible Blender content. I would highly recommend that you check him out. But upon making this sort of no compromises texture scattering solution, we realized that it was kind of just better than everything else out there, so we decided to sell it together as a product. And I haven't really promoted it at all on my YouTube channel. That's because Curtis has already done very in-depth videos on it, and I will link to those. My approach actually doesn't use Voronoi, funnily enough. It uses hexagonal tiling. And why I use hexagonal tiling as opposed to, say, grid tiling or Voronoi, I'll let you try to piece that together on your own because it's a fun exercise in optimization. It even supports things like triplanar mapping and biplanar mapping, and if you haven't heard of biplanar mapping before, it's really cool. It actually uses very similar techniques shown in this video, where instead of projecting a texture on 3 different axes of your mesh, you project it on 2. You project it onto the most significant axis, and then the second most significant, and then you use the sort of edges between those axes to blend between your textures, which sounds very similar to what I'm doing here, and that's for good reason, because it's pretty much the same approach, just in a sort of different context. But yeah, this is something I put a lot of time and effort into, and it's a product that I'm selling with Curtis, so I wanted to share that in case it interests anyone, because maybe this is something that you're looking for. That said, I'm still going to throw this much simpler Voronoi version onto my Gumroad for free, just as I do with all of my other tutorials. And on another note, I made a Discord community. I've been debating whether or not to make a Discord server for a long time because on one hand it gives me a space to engage with people who know me through my art or videos that I wouldn't otherwise have, but on the other hand it's a public Discord server. Still, I decided to make one, so if you want a community that's very focused on like art and game dev and things like that, definitely check it out. It's cool and there are already a lot of cool people in there. Anyways, I hope you learned something, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you so much for watching.